Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining this virtual event entitled Moving Towards Carbon Neutrality. I'm Francois Miller. I'm the Executive Director of the McGill Office of Sustainability. This online event is part of a series of three panels our office is organizing, the two other being on creating a circular economy, and also another one that will be coming up on the role of research to foster sustainable communities. So these panels allow us to really take a deep dive into some of the key items addressed in the McGill Climate and Sustainability Strategy that was recently released last December. As a result of a broad consultation, this strategy uh, identifies three long-term targets. First, to attain a platinum sustainability rating by 2030, then to become zero waste by 2035, and also we're aiming with this strategy to achieve carbon neutrality by 2040, which is the key theme of this session today. So without further ado, I'd like to warmly welcome our three panelists for today. So first we have Charles Choi. Charles is the former president of SSMU Drive Safe, a student-led volunteer service that offers free rides home on selected nights to students. Charles came into this role with a desire to reduce the carbon footprint of Drive Safe's activities. During his presidency, Drive Safe committed to operating a fully electrical fleet by 2030. Charles has also worked towards sequestering and offsetting greenhouse gas emission incurred from DriveSafe's operation. Also have Dr. Cynthia Kallenbach, who's an assistant professor at the McGill Department of Natural Resource Sciences. Her research integrates soil ecology and biogeochemistry to understand soil mechanic matter turnover and accumulation, as well as microbial plant interactions affecting carbon and nutrient cycling under land use and global change. Cynthia has been spearheading the Sustainability of Operation Working Group at the MAC campus since its creation in November 2019. Finally, we have Josh Izinga. He's an manager for utilities and energy management team at McGill. So Josh is responsible for overseeing the implementation of McGill's energy management plan, which cover many key projects aimed at reducing the university's greenhouse gas emissions. So some project that Josh has been involved in recently involve electrification of heating system and various heat recovery projects. So welcome to all of you. Thanks for being here. So I'll leave the rest of the session in the hands of our facilitator today, Agathe Moreau, who works at the Office of Sustainability and who's been instrumental in the development of the climate and sustainability strategy for McGill. So Agathe, over to you.
Mhm. Thanks so much, Francois, and thank you all for being here. It's really a pleasure to have you all on this panel today. This panel that will tackle the topic of moving towards carbon neutrality. So we're happy to announce that this event and the series of events of the Roadshow has been awarded a virtual sustainable event certification by the McGill Sustainable Events Program. So I'd just like to take a moment here with many of us working remotely in different geographical locations. I'd like to just situate ourselves before we dive into the questions to our panelists. So today I'm speaking to you as an uninvited guest on the unceded Indigenous territory, home to the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabe Nation. we honor and recognize the Kanien'kehá:ka, one of the founding nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, as the traditional stewards of the lands and water on which our event virtually takes place. I'd like to extend my gratitude to those who have cared and those who continue to care for the land from which I'm speaking to you today. As a settler that works in sustainability, it's important to recognize the past, but also ongoing consequences of colonialism, especially with regards to how this history influences our perspectives and practices of sustainability. In Jojage, or the city of Montreal, in the language of the Kanien'kehá:ka, and across Turtle Island, we're being called to honor the importance of pluralistic views and definitions of sustainability, as each of those contribute to a holistic understanding of our environment. So today we encourage you to increase your awareness of Indigenous traditions by reading, researching about the lands we occupy. Our office is in this journey as well. All right, so today with our panelists, we'll be exploring three key themes of the climate and sustainability strategy. These themes we'll be exploring in the panel are buildings and utilities, travel and commuting, and landscape and ecosystems. These themes are closely linked to McGill's long-term target of achieving carbon neutrality by 2040, as François was mentioning in the introduction. So for all of our viewers right now, I'd like to remind you that if you have questions to ask our panelists, please send them over to sustainability@mcgill.ca. That's sustainability@mcgill.ca. And we'll take some time at the end of the panel to address these questions. So the guiding question for today is, how can we reduce McGill's carbon footprint? So in 2017, McGill committed to achieving carbon neutrality by 2040. And there's many different ways that we can reach carbon neutrality. And oftentimes we talk about the importance of reducing our carbon footprint. So I just want to take a step back here and take a moment to set the table and make sure that we all start with the same understanding and same definitions. So I'd like to ask you, Josh, with your expertise, managing energy systems, if you can define what carbon neutrality means, and maybe if you can even tell us a little bit more about what a carbon footprint is.
Thanks again. The definition of carbon neutrality means that for every ton of carbon that is emitted, an equivalent amount of carbon is either removed, sequestered, or offset. So for reference, in 2019, McGill's global carbon emissions across scope 1, 2, and 3 type emissions was around 55,000 tons. So in order for us to get to carbon neutrality, we first have to remove or reduce our emissions as much as possible, and then sequester or offset the rest to ultimately bring that to zero to achieve carbon neutrality.
Awesome. And maybe just a note here to our viewers, we might be using the acronym GHG, so for greenhouse gas emissions, for those who are maybe hearing the acronym for the first time. So that's great. And I really like, Josh, that in the introduction, you kind of highlighted the way that we tackle greenhouse gas emissions. So first and foremost, always reducing those emissions, then looking at how they can be sequestered, and lastly, how they can be offsetted. So that's kind of been McGill's approach to carbon neutrality, is really looking at how can we firstly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So, climate change is really one of the biggest and most pressing challenges of our time. Reducing our greenhouse gas emissions globally is really necessary to contain our global warming within 1.5 degrees Celsius, which has been identified by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as a crucial tipping point. And we're approaching it very quickly. So it's a very unprecedented scale of action that's needed here. And what's very interesting is that you all work on different areas of sustainability and all have your expertise in sustainability. Cynthia, your research as an assistant professor focuses on soil ecology and how this affects carbon and nutrient cycling. You're also the co-chair of the MAC Sustainability Working Group. Charles, your expertise coming into DriveSafe and your desire to reduce DriveSafe's carbon footprint has really created your expertise around carbon offsetting and kind of looking at how we can reduce the carbon footprint of transportation. And Josh, your work focuses on looking at big, massive energy systems and how we can optimize those systems to make them emit even less GHG emissions. So I want to ask all of you, and I'm curious to know, what particular projects are you working on right now that will help bring McGill closer to carbon neutrality? So maybe we can start with Charles. Do you feel comfortable starting us off and letting us know, when you were working as a president for DriveSafe, kind of the projects that you were working on there?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Gath, for that. Although much has come to stop because of the pandemic, one of the portfolios that I've been working on during my term as president was trying to pursue our goal of transitioning our vehicles to an all-electric fleet, either through rental or ownership by 2030. Fortunately, the Quebec provincial government announced this past November that they would ban all gasoline-powered cars and SUVs by 2035. Did they copy our plan? I don't know, but I can say it's a pretty good deal. But otherwise, we were able to offset 8.8 tons of CO2 emissions, equivalent to about 38,000 kilometers of driving this past year. We've then offset our carbon emissions by planting 22 trees, investing in a 20 megawatt solar plant in India, and supporting local education initiatives on the environment in Quebec provincial schools. And our organization pledged to continue this annually. And although it is stalled due to COVID-19, I'm sure it'll continue through the years to come.
That's great. Thanks so much, Charles. And it's interesting that you're making the link with the provincial plan that was released, I believe, in December, not too long ago, and the big plan for electrification of the whole transportation system. So it's nice that that DriveSafe was really ahead of that, and it's nice to see that it's transitioning in that direction. Cynthia, would you like to go next and maybe speak about your work as a researcher and also spearheading the MAC Sustainability Working Group?
Yeah, thank you. I think I'll talk maybe about the research we do later.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah, because I wanted to mention this, the MAC Campus Sustainability Working Group, and one of our main goals there is that there's already at MAC Campus a lot of sustainability initiatives and projects associated with reducing carbon footprint, and that are ongoing and led by students. And so one of our objectives as a group is to bring together all of these initiatives and projects in a way that members and leaders of these projects can kind of synergize their efforts, because sometimes they're working in isolation or may not be aware of ongoing projects that might be related. And so we hope to help kind of connect all of these projects together under one umbrella, and at the same time, hopefully provide a way that these projects can be maintained in the future, and so that they have some long-term persistence over time, especially as students who are leading these projects graduate, for example. And so that's one of the things that the MAC Campus Sustainability Working Group is trying to do. We've also come up with some of our own initiatives. A lot of them are still in the feasibility stage. One that we have started, really led by Lindsay Flood, who's a co-chair of the group, is a planting trees project. And so we're planting 100 trees at MAC Campus, and I think we got 20 in the ground in the fall. And so we can come back to this, but vegetation plays a big role in carbon neutrality and achieving carbon neutrality, and also carbon storage. And it provides a lot of other services related to the McGill long-term sustainability plan. So that's something we're really excited about. One thing I'm really excited about is we're looking at the feasibility of setting up an anaerobic digester at the Mac campus farm. And while it's going to have its challenges, I don't think that we should shy away from exploring and trying to implement something like this, because it has a lot of potential impact. So with anaerobic digestion, what we do is we take all of the manure that's generated at the farm, some of which is transported to Ontario, and we run it through this biological process, and it improves the quality of the manure and it reduces its volume. And so then we can also use it as fertilizer that is going to be less detrimental to the environment, but also less of it then needs to be transported off campus. So we're reducing kind of the waste footprint and transportation of the manure. And it generates energy that we hope could supply enough energy for running the farm. So it's a big idea, and Ainsley Merck is looking at the feasibility of that. That's something our group is working towards.
Mm-hmm. And really exciting too, that to see, you mentioned that part of this manure is transported to Ontario, and that's a big, if we're trying to close the gap on reaching carbon neutrality and trying to avoid the emissions from transporting manure elsewhere, and also using that resource as something that can fuel some parts of the university, that's really kind of tackling two angles of looking at these systems as a closed loop system and also kind of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, exactly. It will be challenging, but I'm hopeful that with support and input and advice, we can get something going.
Definitely. And I think that's a nice segue to kind of the projects that you're working on, Josh. So looking at energy systems and looking how we heat and cool our buildings. So I know that you've been up to a lot of things recently. So if you can maybe let us know what are your key projects now and how that's kind of pushing us towards carbon neutrality.
Yeah, I'll focus on our heavy hitters, I guess. So to put things in context, like 70% of the university's greenhouse gas emissions are associated with operating our buildings, heating, cooling, things of that sort of nature. So, and in Quebec, our electricity that we receive from the grid is already relative or very low carbon intensity. It's 95% hydro, and I believe the remaining 5% is from wind. So on the electricity side of things, we're pretty lucky that that's already more or less been addressed. So most of the emissions that are associated with operating our buildings are from burning fossil fuels, predominantly natural gas. So a lot of the projects we have going on are dealing with improving our heating systems or directly converting away from heating systems that use natural gas. So the largest project we have going on right now in terms of greenhouse gas reduction is the electrification of one of our boilers at the downtown main steam plant. That steam plant provides most of the heat to the downtown campus. So replacing one of the boilers there will have a pretty massive impact on our natural gas consumption across the downtown campus. I believe that project alone will reduce natural gas consumption for at least that natural gas account by about 30%, which results in about a 13% reduction in overall greenhouse gas emissions across the university. So a pretty significant project there. And then the other larger projects that we have going on are related to heat recovery. So we'll still have two other larger natural gas boilers at the powerhouse, but the one project we have also going on there is to install a large heat recovery unit to pretty much improve the efficiency of those natural gas boilers. So we squeeze every bit of energy that we can from the natural gas that we burn to be able to use it to either preheat different systems in the powerhouse itself or use it to heat buildings in the nearby area. And then Some other heat recovery projects that we have going on involve more or less creating a smart energy grid, is how we call it. But in essence, it's a heat recovery network. So there are buildings on the campus that require cooling year round. So we take that heat that we would otherwise just be dumping outside and use it to heat other buildings or other spaces across the campus with that heat that has been recovered.
So like a greenhouse, for example?
Yeah. It could be done. Typically, we're talking about data centers, things like that, that are, they, doesn't matter if it's weather like today, they typically need cooling just about year round. And we're moving, heat gets typically generated towards the center of the buildings just from like lights and people and equipment and things like that. But the spaces in the periphery of the building typically need to typically have heating loads during the winter. So by installing certain pieces of equipment and laying out new infrastructure and upgrading our HVAC systems and things like that, we're able to move energy around the buildings. That way we aren't consuming nearly as much natural gas to just to heat the places that need to be heated, and then also cool the places that need to be cooled as well. More or less the projects we have going on into the future are going to be pretty similar to that. Lots of heat recovery, lots of electrification of heating systems.
Mm-hmm. And you were talking about kind of shifting from natural gas boilers to electric boilers. Do we have a lot of boilers on campus? Like, is it kind of one powerhouse that distributes its energy across different quadrants, or how does it it work? If you can give us the big lines of how this big machine and organism works.
So in essence, most of the buildings on the downtown campus are connected via a centralized steam distribution network. So they get all their heat from the powerhouse is what we call it, and that's at the Ferrier building. And then we do have other buildings, we can call them like satellite buildings. They are on our central grid, so they're either they're heated by other means, typically natural gas. So I can anticipate probably there'll be some smaller projects as well that will include electrification of those systems. Just because when you go from natural gas to electric, because our grid is pretty clean, electrically speaking, we're more or less eliminating the greenhouse gas emissions associated with heating the buildings.
Right. Awesome. So yeah, most projects will kind of tackle the downtown powerhouse and the big systems in place there.
Yeah, and to add to Cynthia's comment on the greenhouse, I believe we have a project going on at MAC where that's the plan. More or less be able to utilize the variation in temperature in the greenhouses to either move that energy either to or away from the greenhouses into the buildings that are adjacent to those greenhouses there.
Very neat. Like a smart grid project, but for the MAC campus.
Yeah. Yep.
Very cool. Awesome. I'd like to ask you, Charles, you've talked about so many awesome initiatives that you've put in place with Drive Safe, and from my understanding, it really comes from perhaps your own personal inspiration or your own personal drive to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I'd like to kind of ask you what has inspired you to take action?
For sure. So I think it really started in grade 5 in elementary school when I had a teacher who really inspired me to take on environmental initiatives. We started a gardening club at our school, planting gardens, plants in our front foyer, in the park, and getting our gold standard for our school, and rolling out compost initiatives, recycling, no garbage lunch days, and etc. And I think individual action means a lot. There's this quote that really stuck out to me when I was reading Dr. Seuss's book The Lorax as a child, and it said, quote, "Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better." It's not. And it's true, people like Greta Thunberg or David Suzuki, they didn't come They didn't just decide, let's create an NGO, let's lead a global movement. They started out with their own actions, developed a realization that they needed to empower others, and they wanted to they wanted to create or lead a movement. And for people listening in, you might think there's so much going on in the world, and it might be overwhelming to hear about all these new policies like the Green New Deal, millennials trying to start a movement, and you might think it affects your lifestyle or the way you've been accustomed to. And I think that's fine because there's so many things out there, and it's very overwhelming. And you don't have to be out there protesting, going to door collecting pledges. You don't have to go vegan, although it's great, but it can be much smaller than leading a global movement. It can start out with not sending those two-word replies to your work or school email saying thank you or sounds good, because that creates unnecessary loads onto servers. Just like Josh said, it needs to cool down. We need to operate more fans, AC power to cool them down. It can start with using the backside of a good on one side paper to use for rough notes. We've always had in our classrooms as growing up just a bin with all the good on one side. We called it goose paper. It can be carrying your personal mugs to coffee shops for your late night studying sessions and getting that 10-cent discount, at least during the pre and post COVID times. So these actions, they might seem very little, but they add up and contribute to lessening our carbon footprint and achieving that neutrality. So that's where my desire to go carbon neutral, or to think about just being aware of the little things that I do around the house, um, when I'm studying, when I'm at work, little things like that. They all pile up, contribute to our combined goal of achieving carbon neutrality.
Yeah, thanks for that, Charles. It's super, super inspiring. And I think that, as you mentioned really well, carbon neutrality can feel like kind of a daunting goal. And it's like, what is my contribution? How can I even, do something about it? So it's nice that you're, kind of giving ideas of how people can take individual action. And I think it's really, when it stems from a personal journey, kind of like yours, Charles, it's really, really powerful because you're kind of accumulating these experiences and accumulating the desire to act and take action. And we see it very well with what you've done for Drive Safe. So it's really, really inspiring. And I'd like to kind of do a little segue here. You've mentioned, Charles, that you were inspired by some of the projects that you did in elementary school and kind of starting a garden and all of that. So I want to turn it over to you, Cynthia, if you can tell us a bit more about what is the role of our natural landscapes in carbon sequestration. We've talked about kind of the more technical energy system piece of greenhouse gas reductions. We've talked about, the importance of individual involvement as well. But I was wondering if you could speak to what role forested landscapes, what role soil can play in our carbon sequestration and our response to climate change.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite topics. So I don't know if those listening in are aware, but our soils have more carbon than any other ecosystem in the atmosphere, in the terrestrial planet. So the oceans have more carbon, but if we look at the atmosphere and vegetation and the soils, there's 3 times the amount of carbon in the soil than there is in the atmosphere, and as there is in biomass in vegetation. And so obviously, if we change the landscape and we change the type of plants that are planted, and we change how we manage our lands, we're going to influence the amount of carbon that both goes into the soil for long-term storage, but we're also going to impact the amount that could potentially get released. And when it's released from the soil, it can go back to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide or methane or even N2O. So all of our greenhouse gases, our key greenhouse gases, can come from soil. And so land use plays a big role in moderating how much carbon can get stored in the soil and how much leaves the soil. And so in Canada, some of our land uses or soil ecosystems that store the most carbon are here in Canada. So our wetlands, our peatlands, and our northern permafrost soils, these are soils that are frozen for much of the year. Most of the global carbon stocks are in these northern regions. And so we need to do what we can to protect these particular ecosystems that are very vulnerable. Wetlands store an extraordinary amount of carbon. So restoring native wetlands is a fantastic way to increase carbon sequestration and carbon storage, but also even in our backyard. And I loved hearing about the ways that as individuals we can make a difference that Charles talked about. And so the different types of plants that we grow in our backyard are going to influence how much carbon we can store. The roots from plants play a big role in storing carbon, and just having a permanent cover in your backyard with a lot of roots can help increase the amount of carbon that's stored in your soil. Yeah.
That's so interesting, Cynthia, because I feel like, you know, we have this image of like forested lands as being like the key solution to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, but we often don't think to soil, or we often don't turn to soil as a very, you know, a very interesting solution, and also just, you know, a system that already captures so much of our carbon. And
Yeah.
I'm wondering here if, you know, working at MAC and with all of your research, if you can maybe speak to how certain ways of doing agriculture, certain ways of caring for the soil can perhaps increase our greenhouse gas, and not increase, but can help us capture carbon a bit more. I know there's a lot of techniques out there, and the agricultural field definitely emits a lot of carbon. So is there any way that we can change our practices in the way that we do agriculture so it's a bit more sound?
Yeah, I mean, people spend their whole lives debating the nuances of ways to store carbon, but there's some basic things that we know. And with agricultural systems, one of the biggest issues is that we really are reducing the plant, that material that goes back to the soil. So the carbon input to the soil is ultimately coming from vegetation through photosynthesis. And many of our agricultural systems don't have plants growing during the fall or spring. And we also remove a lot of that material for maybe grain, for feeding cattle, or for our own consumption. And so it doesn't stay necessarily in the soil. And then of course we need to think about life cycle analyses and those things. But so that's a big constraint on storing carbon in agricultural soils. And so one of the best things we can do is just increase the amount of organic material that goes back to the soil. And so we can easily do this through additions of compost and manure. We have to be careful that it's done appropriately so we don't pollute water with excess nutrients and things like that. But this is a really easy way to get carbon back in the soil. Also long-term perennial crops, so forage crops that
cover crops, even maybe.
Cover crops are great. These are crops that a farmer may not grow for consumption, to sell, but they'll grow them as a what you might call a shoulder season plant, or a type of plant that would be in the ground during the time when you're not growing your main crop like corn or lentils or something like that. And these have a lot of benefits, one of them being carbon sequestration. We can also change how much we disturb the soil. So while the balance of carbon in the soil in a natural ecosystem is usually in equilibrium. So you have organic matter going in, and then you have all of the soil microbial community and the biological activity. They respire and breathe carbon dioxide just like us. And in a natural stable system, those are in balance. But in an agricultural system, certain things we do, like tillage, so cultivating the soil. This can speed up some of that respiration or release of CO2. So we can reduce the amount of disturbance of soil. So compost, perennials, big rooting system crops, and reducing disturbance are pretty effective at keeping that carbon there.
And I feel like solutions that aren't too, they're not too, demanding in terms of like economical investment. It's not.
Well, they are.
They are? Okay.
So that's the challenge is we need to rethink like these cover crops, for example. Some of these cover crops farmers could get money for, but so for example, you might plant fava beans as a cover crop, but we don't, there's no market really.
No, there's no market for it. Right.
And so there are challenges that I think in order to get farmers to more widely adopt these practices, we need to rethink our food systems and policies across the supply chain, and because it does require additional costs associated with inputs, labor, knowledge systems. So yeah,
very interesting. And it's I guess something that's interesting from the solutions that you've mentioned is that it doesn't seem like it's technologically heavy. It's not like bringing in a new type of technology or something that we need to innovate. It seems like practices that don't rely on heavy technology. It's just maybe, as you mentioned, a matter of looking at the entire system and kind of seeing how we can shift parts of the systems to perhaps create markets for cover crops or things like that. So it's really, really interesting. I want to turn it over again to Josh, kind of jumping back to energy systems here. Josh, we often hear, people asking about, why don't we install solar panels or wind turbines? So I was wondering, what are some of the hurdles that McGill is facing to transition to sustainable energy systems? And just like, how feasible is it to install these types of sustainable energy systems in urban environments? Like, is it feasible to install a solar panel on campus? So if you can speak to that.
So like I mentioned before, in Quebec, we have the luxury that most of the power that we receive from the utility company is pretty much carbon neutral. So in terms of it here, it's kind of already, it wouldn't really make too much sense from a carbon reduction standpoint, because we would just be offsetting any electricity produced by, say, like rooftop solar or micro wind turbines or anything like that with what is already being with hydropower that's being produced in the province. But like that's more of a situation unique to Quebec, and but if you go to other provinces or other states, the electricity isn't as clean. So issues with those sort of systems, you have a limited amount of space on the roofs. You might have, I guess, different, like you're not going to have, like, you can't utilize the full roof space. Oftentimes the amount of roof area that you have isn't enough to offset all your electricity needs. But specific to, I guess, like to McGill, for some of our like sustainable energy systems, like mainly trying to just get off of natural gas, the biggest impact or the biggest hurdle that we have to overcome is just that natural gas is incredibly cheap right now. So that makes like just your stock standard energy efficiency measures, just trying to reduce natural gas, have longer paybacks. But then it also natural gas as it stands right now is just cheaper than off-peak electric. We have very cheap electric in Quebec, but right now per unit energy, natural gas is still a little bit cheaper. So it makes the financial aspects of energy conversion projects a lot more difficult to justify. So that's definitely our biggest hurdle as it comes to it right now.
Yeah, and I guess we have the biggest blessing of being in Quebec and having a mostly renewable energy grid, which accounts for a lot. Because if we had the same kind of energy use, but would be in another province, I think that our carbon footprint would be a lot higher because we would be connected to a grid that's not necessarily sustainable energy.
Yeah, for sure. And we also run into the situation, which is also unique to Quebec, is that every other electric grid in North America peaks, like the most of the power draw peaks during the summer. In Quebec, there's so much electric heating already that it peaks during the winter. So by us wanting to further electrify our buildings, we run into issues with only being able to operate them off peak in order to not significantly incur additional electrical charges, because that's when those charges happen. If we fire up a couple megawatts of an electric boiler on a cold morning, it will cost a lot. So we still have to burn natural gas in that regard, or reduce it in other means.
We have just a few minutes left to the panel, and I'd like to ask all of you here that, we've talked about many technical solutions to GHG emissions. I'd like to know in your mind, what role can research and education play in reducing our carbon footprint? I don't know if Charles, you want to take a first stab at the question.
Yeah,
From your perspective of being a fourth year student now in political science, is that it?
yes. Well, I think that education has a very big role in this, in that I wouldn't have become such aware of the things going on in the world, the environmental initiatives, without the educators in my elementary school growing up. And that has led me to get a strong basic and fundamental understanding of what's at issue. And even though I'm a political science student, Canadian studies student, far from environmental studies or the scientific elements of the environment and understanding the environment has brought me more aware of these issues. So I think definitely having our educators, be aware of the environmental impacts that are occurring in the world, and then making sure that our kids are the children, those who are growing up, will lead our next generation, are aware of what's going on, is definitely important.
Awesome. Cynthia, do you have anything to add from your end of the spectrum as a researcher?
No, I mean, sometimes I'm a little have an internal conflict because I feel like the research is essential because it's such a complex I don't want to say issue because it's bigger than an issue, but then at the same time, I think we can get buried in some of these complexities and sort of lose sight of what the bigger goal is. So, but ultimately, yes, there are, I think in order to make the right decisions, as they, I was thinking about what Josh was saying, some of the, hurdles, sometimes there's trade-offs in the decisions we make that we might not be aware of, or we might just not think through for the consequences down the road. And I think research can help, help us foresee some of those potential trade-offs.
Definitely. And just quickly before we end here, if I can just ask one of you to bring it back here to the climate and sustainability strategy, and just maybe share what you're most excited to see happen on campus when reading the strategy. If there's something that comes to mind and you're like, oh yes, this is going to be really great.
Sure, I think that it's a very holistic approach that the strategy took. It's speaking as a student, we only tend to see we don't tend to see the operations perspective. We see professors, departmental support staff, dining and hospitality staff at our residences. But going back to when I was in grade 12 high school, thinking about the people who came to the university fairs, hosting the McGill booths, they traveled there, things like that. the food, the produce in our dining halls in the downtown campus that are sourced from the McDonald's campus. All of these are captured in this strategy. So I think it's very well, it captures it very well. But I'm most excited about the student roles in these initiatives. So looking at the document, you see that it's not only faculty-led or student-led, it's very much a whole of McGill approach to tackle this issue. So there's Plate Club, the SMU Equity and Space Fund, the use of the SMU Marketplace. And these are all student initiatives run and operated by students. So I think as a student, we bring forth a passion and desire as the next generation of the world to protect it. And I'm confident that students will be passionate and working towards achieving these goals.
Awesome, Charles. I think I couldn't have hoped for a better ending note here. Very inspiring. So thank you all so much for your time today. And as Charles mentioned, there's many different ways to get involved in sustainability and bring this to life. We'll be hosting one more panel of this series on February 25th, and we'll be looking at the role of research and education in fostering sustainable communities. We'll also be giving some Skills 21 workshops and organizational development workshops that will touch on a whole bunch of different subjects and sustainability. So you can check out our Facebook for more information. And thank you all so much to our great panelists today. It was a pleasure to have you, and hopefully see you soon again.
Thanks, Agat.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Take care.